I'm really aware that, you know, it's been a bit of a long weekend and you've had a lot of information. You're there with your notebooks and everything like that. There's been loads of inspiring stuff going on. I'm going to keep it a bit light and fluffy here, and it's very much my subjective view of what surfing is and what it means to me, and how I've built it into quite a bit of the rest of my life, despite you know, the difficulties and sometimes the trying nature of trying to slot the surfing life into regular life and stuff like that. So, but what I want to try and inspire in people is that something, living your life in pursuit of something as transient as a wave can lead ultimately to a fulfilled and creative and unexpectedly productive existence. And if the idea of seeing your life's project as kind of a magic carpet, the way I've always seen it is that surfing is something that can take you anywhere you want it to take you, as long as you practice it with the kind of the right intent. And you can apply a lot of principles that you learn through the ocean to your work life, your family life, your personal life. But I'm going to show you some nice pictures as well and talk about the idea of the surf and what it's meant over the years, and some nice films as well. So I'm going to just scroll through some pictures. Just some lovely pictures. A lot of them come from my book of surfing. So what I'm going to argue is that sustaining a lifetime of wave riding is one of the most difficult things that you can do at times. I mean, I personally cram my life into contortion sometimes to try and keep surfing, despite constant growing responsibilities of family, employment, finance and ego. To continue to stay focused on something as life-affirming but yet as transient as a wave. Sometimes it requires a lot of ingenuity, a lot of dedication, and not a lot of, quite a bit actually, of self-centered stupidity sometimes, and my wife and my family will attest. There are tons of real-life things to worry about, and surfing doesn't, you know, help you avoid those things, of course. The usual troubles of bills, the mortgage, the rent, stuff. And there's the kids, family obligations of community, career and aspiration. But on the grander level, there's also things like those existential questions of who you are, what's your worth, and what you're leaving behind in the world. And the other thing is, the difficult thing about surfing these days, that so many people have begun this surfer's life over the last few years, that everyone thinks they understand what it's all about now. And one of the reasons that the surfer's passions have been commodified and co-opted and condensed into an apparently meaningless series of brands, styles, symbols, logos, myths, initiations, contradictions and cliches. Everyone thinks they understand about surfing, and everyone's wrong. Because like waves, in their infinite variety, there are infinite variations on a surfer's way of seeing the world. So before sharing with you my view of the meaning of surfing, how I've attempted to apply it to my life, I want to give you a little whistle-stop tour of some of the ways that people have looked at surfing, and some of the ways that I think are right and some of the things that I think are wrong. There's the Pope in the living room there, the Pope's living room. And first of all, I'm going to show you, before I start on talking about what the surfer is and how he's been represented, I want to show you one of my favourite surf movie sequences.
In all the things you say, what comes is better than what came before, and you better come to me, better come to me, better run to me, better come. Oh,
thank you to Andrew Kidman there from made a lovely film called Glass Love, and Andrew makes beautiful films about the real experience of being a surfer, rather than a lot of these commodified and a lot of these misunderstood cliches that a lot of companies and corporations have bought into. And the cult of the surfer has kind of arisen through these various processes, and I want to talk a bit about that now. You see him everywhere, really, the surfer. He sells everything you could possibly want. Dry cleaning services in a Honolulu strip mall, t-shirts, flip-flops at Bali Airport. He'll make you strong coffee in that cool little corner of Lisbon and organise car insurance for you in Kyushu. In campaigns the world over, he'll sell you, what will he sell you? He'll sell you special edition Peugeots, little Nissans, vinyl floored 4x4s. He's even been seen these days slinging space in high-end retirement homes and 5-star holiday packages. Such is the ever-present and ever-increasing breadth and depth of his demographic appeal. Don't even mention the hair products for boys and Cornish pasties. He regales in his clean-limbed, strong-boned frame, and his steady, sun-kissed features watch over us with calm condescension. He represents authenticity in a way, in a world where the original has ceased to exist. He might be a facsimile without a master document, but we need to believe in his saline truth. He's here, he's now, he's everywhere. He's the surfer. But how has the cult of the surfer been created? Why is the surfer's image so powerful and yet so misunderstood? Well, one view, and it's my view, is that an elite band of wealthy men and women control the planet's imagery. From their meeting rooms and their workstations, they can manipulate the desires of the rest of us. They shimmy up the greasy pole of corporate achievement, tortured by this kind of insane desire for status, the sort of status that can only be achieved by the corporation and endorsed by the corporation. These group of individuals can only feel really at one with their selfhood once they've achieved on their own terms. And ultimately this leads to a kind of quite an empty existence of just completely, where am I? It leads to a bit of an empty existence, really. Once you've paid off your mortgage and your sports wagon, you'll buy your gym membership to get back in touch with your body and back in touch with who you are physically. But that quickly becomes boring. So uncomfortable with the constant static simulation of ardour, they decided to look out there in the environment for a kind of release. And they found it at the weekend down at the beach. And they admired the surf school jocks with their clear skin and sculpted latimus dorsi, and they envied the core local crew sat there on the beach meanwhile, gazing for hours into the surf with a faraway look in their eyes. They made a few trips and caught their first waves, and they went back to work and began to think of themselves as surfers. But soon the tiny moments of truth they experienced in the water began to anchor their existences into the natural world, and eventually this image began to radiate outward from their offices via account managers and creatives, many of whom have had a similar tongue-tip taster of surfing themselves. Incrementally, surfing became encoded in the graphic language of the 20th century, and the perceptions and experiences of riding a wave were sold back to us, the landlocked masses. And here in the 21st century is deeply encoded in our ideas about the natural man. The process has happened in at least 3 distinct waves over the last 100 years. At the turn of the century, the privileged classes of America discovered the joys of Waikiki in Hawaii. Writers like Jack London wrote a series of pieces in the popular press on the natural wonders of the surf and the incredible athletic abilities of the beach boys who taught them. Soon, in the American imagination, which was in the embryonic phases of world domination and only just out of an apocalyptic civil war, had placed Hawaii at the front of their brain as the idea of the epitome of the tropical picturesque. The process was repeated at Malibu at the end of the 50s for a post-war rock and roll generation nauseous with chrome-clad wealth that was motored by the hatreds of the Reds under the bed. The dark and the light of the atomic surf boom and the post-Sputnik paranoia of Middle America was represented by Mickey Dora's dark pranksterism and the cheesesteak cheesecake grin of Gidget. These were the yin and the yang of surf culture as we know it. And at the end of the 60s, the loss of American innocence came to fruition in the killing fields of Southeast Asia. I don't know why I'm looking at a blonde girl, but she looks nice, doesn't she? Missed timing. Meanwhile, Whitey went to the moon and surfers reached to a different place by tuning into the cosmos, turning into psychedelic drugs and dropping out of mainstream society. In the wake of this, the 70s changed forever the way that surfers rode waves and the way they looked at waves. The long, easy gliding surfboards of the previous generations were butchered into sharp, streamlined speed sticks, and the line of the ridden wave converted to a high-frequency attack, where before it had all been about easy trim and flow and grace. Soon the dynamic movements of the shortboard riding surfer had reached out and over the lip of the breaking wave and were cross-fertilising with the thrash and burn aesthetic of skating. By the end of the 80s, extreme sports took surfing's essence and racked up a line, applying to its creed a panoply of stupid pursuits and pierced and tattooed primitivism of its protagonists. There was an increase in environmental awareness peppered through this new extremist creed, but it was mainly a ballistic explosion in media and the advertising that would pay for it that drove the millennial boom in surfing, skating and snowboarding. By the end of the 20th century, it was a truly global billion-dollar industry. Now that we're painfully aware of the preciousness of the ocean as a finite resource, sensitive to our greed and carelessness, the surfer, more fundamentally immersed in the environment than any other individual, is now perhaps the most potent aspirational archetype out there. Riding just ahead of the curl, tapping into the power of the planet, we now recognise as being fragile, sensitive, as well as unforgiving. The surfer holds the key to something of which the rest of us knows not. But why is this need for authenticity in the first place? Why do we need to access some kind of hidden realm guided by the surfer as an archetype? Well, ever since he's been removed from living in extended clans and tribal groupings, tending the land and fishing the seas with his brothers and sisters, ever since he was forced away from his spiritual and aesthetic connectedness to the planet, modern man has moved further and further away from himself, further away from his very being, in a sense. Human commerce evolved in a way more quickly than the human soul ever could. The feudal system, the workhouse, and then the railroad begat in man a spiritual decline that was replaced by a messianic stick and the carrot of the promised land. Hawaii thus represented for the Victorians a return to an Eden-like naturalness, and 50 years later the scene at Malibu turned on all those existentialists listening to bebop. For them, surfing was an answer to the question of being and nothingness, while the Valley Kooks and the ad agencies and the Brill Cream jocks, meanwhile, imagined a dream of girls, girls, girls and fun, fun, fun. In the absence of visceral belief, mankind made up subcults, and the way of the surfer is the 20th century subculture in them all. We grew to need subcults like surfing because of the unparalleled wealth we were experiencing, at least in the developed world. Since the coming of industry, we had lost so much. Before mankind had been drawn into the slavery of trade, it was the unseen world that defined worth. Shamans were the communicators, mediators between the seen and the unseen world. They were the medicine men and the soothsayers, the sangomas and the spirit guardians, protectors of warrior creeds and cults of initiation that separated the raw from the cooked, the seen and the unseen, the hidden, the now and the forever. To achieve status in pre-modern societies, men and women would take part in cults of initiation that tested their qualities of individuals. Only through communicating with this unseen realm and transcending the base realities of their own flesh could any kind of status and success be achieved. Thus, the surfer of the 21st century is now a ubiquitous ideal. He sees the world through a lens of his own creation. To become a surfer is to ascribe to a set of rituals and practices that are passed on largely orally from surfer to surfer, and via cultish magazines, films and art, and through the arcane language of dudish. To become a surfer, one must move, in a sense, from the raw to the cooked, and in the process he must dig deep into one's physical and spiritual being to conquer some of the most severe physical and practical problems that man can face. Not only must the surfer learn to paddle out the back in even the most extreme conditions, and then to ride a seething crystallisation of energy wrought in liquid. But he must also organise his life around the rhythmic, natural oscillations of the moon, the stars and the ocean. The surfer's whole existence is governed not by commerce, but by waves themselves. And it is this foregrounding of the rhythmic ebb of moon, tide and wind and swell that ultimately empowers the cult of the surfer. And in a sense, Timothy Leary said it best about 30 years ago. In a sense, the LSD popping professor of psychedelia came out with some tangential theories in his time. But what he said about surfers made sense to me. When the kids at Harvard started communing with their shamanistic selves via psilocybin towards the end of the 50s, Leary, who was the professor of psychology at the time, he went along for the ride, and he quickly realised that through the study and use of psychedelic drugs, he could begin to peel back the layers that had been stacked on his culture. And at some point, he started noticing the kids at the beach and the decadence with which they appeared to cherish at the centre of their lives. And Leary spoke at length about surfers being at the leading edge of human evolution. He thought that humankind was evolving towards a state of purely aesthetic being. In his view, surfers were closest that you could get to that aesthetic way of being, closer than any other group of individuals you could ever think of. His way of thinking was like this: man had evolved around city-states dedicated to storing more food and symbols of wealth than he needed for daily reproduction. He was riddled with fear and loathing of what lay immediately in the future. And the whole of culture had evolved around storing stuff, being acquisitive. And he saw that as being an entirely faulty consciousness. And he saw that in reality, the transcendent dance, the beautifully meaningless yet profoundly life-affirming celebration of the extreme present, should be placed higher than all else above these things. He regarded a group of people in the modern age that would dedicate themselves to the dance most radically, or the tribe known as surfers. The truly dedicated surfer designed his entire life around the moment of the ridden wave, and thereby transcended the base ancient realities of feeding, clothing and housing himself. And therefore, for Leary, the surfer was the very definition of the evolved human being. He was without status, without outward displays of achievement. The surfer lived with the past exploding behind him and the future walling up ahead of him, and begging it to be created. I can't think of a better image for the surfer as a modern primitive, and no better validation for surfing as a noble way to live. And now I'm going to show another one of my favourite clips. This for me sums up the dance of the surfer. Well, thanks to Jay Brother, who's a filmmaker making an amazing film about a surfer called Joel Tudor, without doubt one of the greatest surfers that's ever lived. And to me, that grace and flow and that almost completely instinctive unity of the man, the board and the wave, to me that demonstrates that beautiful dance, that transcendent dance that is surfing. And I can't surf anything like that, I wouldn't even even claim that, but I've talked about surfing and what it's meant to me, but now I'm going to talk about how I've tried to feed that into my other working life. And it's been a bit of a twisted path for me. Surfing first entered my consciousness when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and I saw a clip of surfing on Dickie Davis's World of Sport. I don't know if you remember that. And I remember what I've worked out now. It was a 1974 Waimea Bay competition in Hawaii. I mean, I was about 8 or 9, a little kid in East London, and to me it was just kind of this incredible alien world that seemed to promise me everything that I was not, and it somehow stayed in my consciousness for a long, long time. And then when I was about 13, I had a really glamorous uncle called Uncle Mike, God rest his soul, and I was messing around in his bedroom one day, and I looked in his bedside cabinet, and I found a stack of magazines. There was the Playboy magazines, there was motorsport magazines, but then there was a stack of surf magazines as well. And despite all what you get in Playboy magazines and the Ferraris and the motorsport magazines, it was surfing that really stuck out. And it was a strange thing to be into for a 13-year-old kid, but I had posters of surfing up on my wall in East London next to Billy Bonds lifting the FA Cup. And I didn't even know all through that time that it was possible to surf these islands, you know. It was so not part of my world, so not part of my consciousness, that somewhere in my mind I aspired to it in this kind of really deep level, and I didn't even really have the language to describe it at the time. You know, our family holidays involved going to Clacton on the South End coast, and there's no surf in Essex. You know, out of anywhere in the island, these islands where waves break, there's probably least likely to get a surf in Essex. And so really, I created this imaginary, as I've been talking about, of surfing in my own mind. I was subject to anyone as that. You know, I listened to the Beach Boys on the quiet, because it wasn't cool to listen to the Beach Boys when the Clash and the Specials were out, and that was what was my sort of post-punk mates were into, and I'd quietly listen to Brian Wilson and get all romantic about, you know, all the things that the surfer meant, and the places where I could go and travel to and exist as a surfer. And so basically I saved up working on a building site for a couple of years after school, and I went to Australia, and I first paddled out at Noosa Heads and went surfing for the first time, and that was it. I've been kind of ruined ever since, but it's been a bit of a twisted path, and I've tried to kind of, as I started out the talk by saying, I've been really, I've twisted my life into contortion to be able to carry on surfing, and I've managed to drag my working life into it. And this image of the magic carpet is always in my mind. I knew that being a surfer would give me an excuse in a way. It'd give me this magic carpet that I could carry around the planet and have a validation for being there. And it continues to inspire me, you know. So travel around the world for a good few years trying to be a surfer. And I'm going to have to read out this because I can't remember what I was going to say now. It was a real good time of endless adventure, really. I'd say perfect Noosa Heads was my first surf experience, and I went to Sydney. I was shouted at by aggro locals at Bondi. I suffered numerous humiliations and frustrations in Australia trying to be a surfer. It's that cult of initiation I was talking about is a real one. You know, you get shouted at, you're made to look an idiot, you're called an idiot, and sometimes you even suffer physical violence for getting in people's way. Even today that still happens. And just about as I felt I was about to crack the elusive art of negotiating Sydney's sandbars, my visa ran out and I was back to California, and then went to Central America, down in Mexico, and ended up in El Salvador with an alcoholic, sex-addicted kneeboarder from Lantuit Major, of all places. And this was a real defining moment in my life. I was 19, This guy was 33 years old, and he just like heavy barreling waves, and I was a real neophyte surfer still. And I met the guy's name was Phil, and we were travelling in Mexico, and I was trying to get people to come with me to El Salvador because it sounded good. There was a right-hand point break there called La Libertad, and La Libertad meant freedom. And in my mind, that again, more romance in my mind, I wanted to go there. And the fact that there was a civil war on meant that there was going to be no one else there. So I liked the idea even more. And eventually I convinced this mad Welshman to come with me to El Salvador. And it was like just an incredible time because there was such a feeling of being right there at the edge of things where the tectonic plates of history were really integrating, were crushing up against one another. And yet here we were surfing, a completely meaningless act that was all the more beautiful because of its context. And that's really stayed with me. And I saw back then that if I could tell stories like this about this time and this place, I might be able to convince a few people that I was alright and they might be able to pay me, you know. So to do that, and so that sounded good to me. I saw that as a way of being able to ride that magic carpet to where I wanted it to go. And so after a couple more years of travelling, I found myself back in England on a building site again. And you know, I knew I couldn't really deal with that sort of existence. I'm going to go back to my notes because I'm getting lost again. Yeah, I hit back in London in 1988, and London and my friends were in the throes of this sort of chemically driven youth culture. Acid house had hit, and it really kind of completely had changed my hometown that I left about 6 years before, and I went along for the ride. But I knew I had to get away from that just constant reproducing myself. So I went to college, then university, and began writing for local papers and the student rags. And I was lucky with perfect timing and positioning. I left college just at the time of the biggest magazine boom in history. James Brown launched Loaded in 1992, 93, I think it was. And I started doing a lot of music journalism. And I knocked on the door of Dazed and Confused, convinced Jefferson to give me a desk and a phone, and some jumped up title was a contributing features editor or something like that. But it allowed me to indulge my obsessions. Again, I started seeing Dazed, particularly during this time, as a real way to ride a magic carpet to where I wanted it to go. And I indulged my obsessions in places like Kosovo and Bosnia and Colombia. And I wanted to go to all these places where I saw myself at the cutting edge of things. But just at that sort of time as well, the world of snowboarding had really sort of started to explode. And all of a sudden there was budget in the world of snowboarding. Again, that kind of extreme sports industry had really started to hit, as I mentioned earlier. And all of a sudden we were getting taken on press trips to the mountains. And somewhere along the line, I remembered that hit of being a surfer again. After a couple of years of being in London and living this sort of life with doing music journalism and fashion and going to all these strange places like Kosovo and Bosnia. And I started to think of myself as someone that wanted to carry on with this world, but I wanted to get back to where I originally started from in the world of surfing. So the idea of Adrenalin arrived, and Adrenalin was like the best job that I could possibly have in publishing. It was a global quarterly, went out in 4 different languages, about skate, surf, snowboarding, and it really was my platform for about 5 years. I was able to do exactly what I wanted, to ride that wave wherever I wanted it to go. You know, and I think the thing about Adrenalin was that we had complete freedom, and that's something that's really, really rare. And I think what the point I wanted to get to make here, for a really tangential, circuitous route, is that if you do something with pure passion and pure heart, if it's based on real visceral things you've experienced, and if you really focus in on where you're trying to be in the world, and you you keep on insisting to going back to what you wanting to do, then any project like that attracts people, and it attracts funding, and it attracts a way of being in a world where you really can ride a magic carpet to where you want to be. And so they're beautiful things. If you can find your own magic carpet, the grace of their flight really attracts people. And side projects emerge every day. Possibilities rhythmically emerge when people can see that the people who make the magazine or the project, whatever it is, are having truthful, unmediated fun. And the magazine, whatever it might be, it could be an industry, it could be a product. It becomes a surfer on its own. It becomes an exploiter of a fleeting opportunity, trimming along at the edge of the curve with the past exploding behind it. The curtain of creativity folding over your head and the future unfolding out on the face before it, and its footsteps hopefully disappear in the sand.